A single phone call, and suddenly the markets moved. Oil prices dropped almost instantly. Stock markets surged upward. Analysts scrambled to understand what had just happened. And at the center of it all was one unexpected statement from Donald Trump. In a brief comment to reporters, Trump claimed the war with Iran was very complete, pretty much done. At first, it sounded like a bold political statement, but within minutes, something unusual happened. Financial markets across the world reacted as if the conflict had suddenly taken a completely different direction. Energy traders began selling oil futures. Stock indexes climbed rapidly. Commentators on financial networks started talking about a possible return to stability. But here's where things started getting strange. Only hours earlier, senior military officials were saying something very different. According to them, the real campaign had barely even begun. Two completely different stories about the same war. One suggested the conflict was wrapping up quickly. The other hinted it might just be getting started. And then another detail quietly surfaced. Around the same time these statements were being made, Trump had reportedly spent nearly an hour on the phone with Vladimir Putin. The timing raised eyebrows across the political world. Was this simply political messaging? A strategy designed to calm global markets? Or was something far bigger unfolding behind closed doors? To understand why this moment shocked analysts, you have to rewind to the beginning of the conflict and how quickly everything escalated. When tensions between the United States and Iran began rising again, most experts believed a confrontation was possible, but very few predicted how quickly events would spiral. For years, the relationship between Washington and Tehran had been defined by a cycle of pressure, warnings, and brief moments of calm. Military analysts often described it as a delicate balance, dangerous, but carefully managed. That balance began to crack when new intelligence reports suggested Iran had expanded certain military programs and regional operations. Almost immediately, discussions inside Washington intensified. Officials debated whether stronger deterrence measures were needed. Within days, reports began circulating that American forces had launched a coordinated series of major strikes targeting Iranian military facilities. The scale of the operation surprised even experienced observers. Early briefings suggested the strikes focused on several key areas: missile storage sites, drone manufacturing centers, radar systems, and logistics networks believed to support regional operations. Satellite images appearing online seemed to show multiple large explosions across different parts of the country. Videos spread rapidly across social media. Bright flashes lit up the night sky as distant explosions echoed across urban areas. While many details were difficult to verify in real time, one thing became clear very quickly: the operation was massive. Some reports claimed thousands of targets had been hit within the first wave alone. Military analysts began examining the pattern of the strikes. Many concluded the operation appeared designed to severely weaken Iran's ability to coordinate large-scale responses. But this kind of campaign usually takes time. Conflicts involving sophisticated military infrastructure rarely end in a matter of days. Most experts predicted the confrontation would stretch for weeks, possibly even months. And that's why Trump's latest statement caught so many people off guard. Because according to the timeline experts expected, the operation had barely begun. In a short interview that quickly spread across television networks and online news platforms, Donald Trump made a claim that few analysts were expecting. He suggested the war was essentially finished. According to Trump, the early strikes had already achieved most of their objectives. He described Iran's military infrastructure as severely damaged and claimed several major capabilities had been neutralized. In his words, the mission had been extremely effective. The statement was brief, but its impact was immediate. Within minutes, financial markets reacted. Oil prices, which had surged when the conflict first began, started falling sharply. Investors who had been preparing for a prolonged crisis suddenly began shifting their expectations. Stock markets rebounded across several major exchanges. Financial analysts later explained that even the suggestion of a short conflict can dramatically influence market behavior. Energy traders constantly try to predict how geopolitical events might affect supply. If a conflict threatens to disrupt oil shipments, prices usually rise quickly. But if it appears the situation may stabilize sooner than expected, the opposite happens. And that's exactly what unfolded. The problem was that Trump's comments didn't seem to match what military officials were saying behind the scenes. And within hours, another interview would make that contradiction impossible to ignore. While Trump's remarks were still dominating headlines, another interview began circulating in the media. This time the comments came from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Instead of suggesting the conflict was ending, his remarks painted a far more cautious picture. He indicated the operation was still developing, and that the United States was prepared to take additional actions if necessary. To some observers, his comments suggested the campaign might still be in its early stages. That created a rare moment of confusion. The president appeared to be signaling that the mission had largely succeeded, while defense officials seemed to be preparing the public for the possibility of continued operations. Political analysts immediately began debating what this meant. Some suggested the conflicting messages were simply the result of different communication styles. Others believed the contradiction might actually be intentional. In international conflicts, public messaging can sometimes serve strategic purposes. A government might signal strength in one direction, while leaving room for negotiations in another. And that possibility became even more interesting when another detail quietly emerged. Around the same time these mixed messages were spreading across headlines, reports emerged about a long phone call between Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to official summaries, the call lasted close to an hour. The two leaders reportedly discussed several global issues, including the developing situation in Iran. At first glance, the call seemed routine. Leaders often communicate during major geopolitical crises, but analysts quickly noticed something unusual about the timing. Russia has historically maintained a complicated relationship with Iran. While the two countries do not always agree, they have cooperated strategically in several areas over the years. That meant Moscow could potentially play an important diplomatic role if negotiations ever entered the picture. Some commentators began speculating that discussions about de-escalation might already be happening quietly, behind closed doors. Others suggested the call could have been focused on preventing the situation from escalating into a broader international confrontation. Whatever the purpose, the conversation added another layer of mystery. Because while public statements created confusion, private discussions between world leaders might have been shaping the situation in ways the public couldn't yet see. Whenever a major geopolitical crisis unfolds, speculation spreads quickly, and this situation was no exception. Across political talk shows, social media platforms, and policy forums, analysts began proposing several different theories about the conflicting messages. One interpretation suggested Trump's comments were designed primarily to calm global markets. Financial panic can sometimes make geopolitical situations worse. If energy prices surge too quickly, economic instability can spread across multiple countries. By signaling that the conflict might be nearing its end, leaders could potentially prevent that kind of panic. Another theory focused on negotiation strategy. In diplomacy, public messaging sometimes serves as a signal to other governments. Declaring that objectives have already been achieved could open the door for de-escalation, talks without appearing to retreat. Of course, none of these interpretations were confirmed. Officials rarely reveal the full reasoning behind public statements during active conflicts. But the speculation itself demonstrated how unusual the situation had become. Because normally, military messaging during wartime follows a carefully coordinated script. Here, the narrative seemed far less clear. The reason this conflict attracted so much attention is simple. Iran occupies a strategically critical position in the global energy system. The country sits near several key shipping routes used to transport oil across the world. Even small disruptions in the region can affect supply chains, transportation costs, and energy prices. That's why governments across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East immediately began monitoring the situation closely. Diplomats urged restraint. Some governments quietly began reinforcing defensive measures. Meanwhile, international organizations called for dialogue. Behind the scenes, several countries reportedly began exploring ways to encourage negotiations before the situation could escalate further. Because history has shown that conflicts in this region can quickly expand beyond their original scope. And once that happens, controlling the consequences becomes far more difficult. By the end of the week, two very different narratives had taken hold in the global conversation. One version suggested the United States had already achieved its primary objectives, and that the conflict was rapidly winding down. The other suggested the early strikes were only the first phase of a much longer campaign. Both possibilities carried enormous implications. If the conflict truly was ending quickly, it would represent one of the fastest military turnarounds in recent memory. But if the campaign was only beginning, the world might still be facing weeks or even months of uncertainty. And in situations like this, the truth often takes time to fully emerge, because the most important strategic decisions rarely happen in front of cameras. They happen quietly behind closed doors, in conversations the public never hears. For now, the situation remains one of the most confusing geopolitical moments in recent years. A president declaring the war nearly finished, military officials hinting the campaign might still be unfolding, financial markets reacting instantly to every new statement. And somewhere in the background, world leaders holding private conversations that could shape what happens next. History has shown that moments like these often look very different once the full story finally becomes clear. What appears to be the end of a crisis can sometimes turn out to be the beginning of a much larger chapter. And until more information emerges, one question continues to hang in the air. Was the war truly almost over? Or were we only witnessing the opening moves of a far bigger geopolitical game?